The closing arguments in this whole issue were yesterday. The judge finally ruled today. The judge ruled in William's favor on every count. And to help explain to us exactly what happened and what went down and what was said is the one, the only, Dodge Landesman. How are you doing, Dodge?
I'm well. How are you? Very well, because good news, we got a good verdict. So I would say better than ever. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for being here with me. Please tell us everything that went down in the ruling, what the judge said, and anything interesting in closing arguments.
Yeah, it was a very interesting case. This probably is one of the longest restraining order cases that I've really ever heard of. It's unusual for it to go on a multitude of weeks, probably 4 weeks altogether. So we'll start with the verdict. The verdict is the temporary restraining order. It will not be converted into an actual restraining order, nor will it be granted. So it is entirely dismissed. Streets LA wins the case entirely. And what's impressive is that it's a straight flush. They talk about these 5 different incidences, these 5 interactions that Streets has with Joey Rocket. On each one of those 5 interactions, he asserted his right to protest as well as his right for free speech. The judge confirmed that over and over. They tried to paint William as somebody who made direct threats to Joey because he used the F word, for example, and the F word could indicate some sort of violence. So that's just one of many examples of the many stretches of arguments that Joey's attorney tried to use. But essentially what they were saying is that Joey was this poor, unconnected, innocent man that William would frequently go over to try to harass. He would go out of his way to harass Joey, where in reality, Joey would insert himself into the situation. There are a few more arguments. One was about doxing. Joey's attorney said, how dare William doxed Joey. After an incident, he wanted to get information about Joey because he was interfering with his right to protest. So he used facial recognition and put a Twitter post saying, do you recognize this guy? William's attorney was incredibly deft and remarked that simply Streets was trying to identify the person who was interfering with his right to free speech. So any sort of harassment, anything like that, it all circles down to William simply, to Streets LA, simply wanted to continue the protest. So it was a stretch of an argument from the beginning, and the attorney used probably the same 5 arguments over and over.
Interesting. So the closing arguments went on, I heard, for quite a long time yesterday. What was going on there?
Yes, the closing arguments, it was an entire court, it was 2 entire court sessions. So entirely the closing arguments must have been collectively about 6 hours, I would say. So there were some long, intense closing arguments, and for half a day in court and then the entire day yesterday for court, it only consisted of the closing arguments. So yes, they were long. The closing arguments were essentially a rehashing a lot of what I just said, but a few extra jabs. One of the hilarious things is that Streets LA's attorney said, well, Joey is potentially a straw man for Scientology. And then the attorney for Joey says, my client is a man. I don't know why you're identifying him as a straw man, but my client is an animator. My client is a friend. My client is a loving dog owner. So every little thing that he could try to harass or to harangue the opposing counsel on, but that didn't actually have any real merit, he tried to do so. So that was one of his arguments. He made the argument about doxing, that Joey was essentially doxed, that was not okay. He made the argument, the big argument that was being made in the closing argument is that Streets LA is responsible for the content in his chats. That these chats were going by essentially goading and directing William to directly have interaction with Joey, and that the chat was harassing the Joey. And because of that, and they were telling William to go, William was making a concerted effort to harass Joey. It was a stretch. And then Streets LA's attorney quickly retorted. She said, listen, William Good has over 200,000 subscribers. The chat goes by a mile a minute. You're not even going to be able to look it up. And what was funny is that the attorney for Joey tried to use an example of the speed of the chat to remark that Streets LA would be able to see it, but he used the computer. So the attorney for Joey used the wrong format. So it's like, good job, stupid. So, you know, I mean, he was talented in a lot of ways, but really idiotic in others. But at the end of the day, they just simply didn't have that much of a leg to stand on. The other aspect that was remarked upon in the closing arguments was that Streets LA is profiting. That isn't relevant to this case. And the judge later remarked in her ruling that all this stuff about the profit is not a relevant argument. So Joey's attorney spent a collective 4 hours, probably 5 separate times, talking about how William profits from this. That entire argument was useless. But he tried to use how much he profits. He tried to bring up Jessica Palma-Dessa, remark that she was goading, and that there are kind of part of this cabal, part of this conglomerate. And finally, Joey's attorney remarks that there was an incident where there was a gaggle of kids also sort of protesting, and they were being a little unruly. And that essentially William was encouraging them to harass Joey, that their words were more vitriolic, more extreme towards Joey. But there was actual footage of William saying, hey, leave him alone, stop it. And William's attorney was able to assert that he was simply trying to get the kids to calm down so he could follow every letter of the law, so he could continue consistently protesting. So again, man, it was like point, counterpoint, point, counterpoint. The attorney tried to break something up, and then it was entirely negated. So yeah, all of this relies upon these 5 incidences. And what was interesting in the closing argument of Streets LA's attorney, what she said is, she says, listen, you can say this guy's being harassed, but what's the typical pardon my finger, what's the typical definition of harassment? The usual definition would be consistently following somebody, would be trying to contact them, would be following them home, would be making a death threat, would be emailing them, would be contacting their family members. None of this happened. What simply happened is all 5 of these were interactions in public in plain view. But not only that, but it wasn't on some residential cul-de-sac. It was on Hollywood Boulevard. I'm sorry, that's one of the 10 most pedestrian-heavy sidewalk streets in the entire nation. And so all of these interactions took place within vicinity of that location, entirely in public view, when Joey was going to this location with the understanding that it was protesting. None of the attorneys said this, but what it all boils down to, and why Will won, is that this was mutually assured destruction, right? You could say, the judge did say that William was, her exact words of William was being nasty and vitriolic with his words, but mutually assured destruction, if you go into that environment and you accept that you're going to have these nasty interactions, and you come to that same location, you don't live in that location, you don't need to go to that location for work, yet you still keep coming back. I'm sorry, that is mutually assured destruction. Finally, what's fascinating is that Streets LA's attorney got this quote from Joey Eckers, and he said, "Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me." Sorry, that's him giving permission. That's him giving permission for all this stuff that William is throwing at him. He has verbally said, I'm not going to be hurt. Words can never hurt me. So his bluff was called, and this ruling was made. But yes, it was them really trying to grasp at straws and portray Joey as this kind of victimized old man. It was very funny. In the first hearing, he showed up with a walker. He wanted to appear that he was old, and then he fainted in the courtroom, and then outside the courtroom, he was getting preliminary medical care, and yet he refused to actually be put in an ambulance or get further medical care. Of course, he wanted to do this when the door was open, and he was hoping that the judge would take a little peekaboo and feel sympathy for this sad old man, who's not very sad. And to Joey's credit, he was seen going for a nice hike on Runyon Canyon, so I will credit him for his energy and his vigor, but worked against him in this ruling here, I would say.
Joey pulled my pearls.
Oh, my pearls. Exactly.